Hey, again with the great Chris Ferguson. How are you doing today, Chris?
Doing very well, thank you. Yeah, it's summer break, so things are good.
Awesome, awesome. Well, this is part four of the book interview. There might have to be a part five, but I think we're going to make some good
Oh,
headway today.
I gotta start getting hate mail from you listeners. Get off this guy's podcast.
I think they like you, actually. I think they like you.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Based on the
In that
poll
case,
results.
should we send where can they send money to me? Let's see.
Well, I don't know if they like you that much.
No, of course, I know what he does. Yeah, that's fine.
They're saving their money for my Kickstarter.
There we go. There we go. That's cool.
All right, well, Chris, you just got back from vacation. Do you want to talk about that? How'd it go?
Yeah, so it was good. I went to Hawaii, which is this is probably I was probably my what the hell has it been? The fourth or fifth time in Hawaii? I'm trying to remember now. Probably fifth time in Hawaii. I love Hawaii. It's which is funny coming from Florida because it's not that different, but it's actually a lot of fun to be there. I was at a conference on trauma and violence and abuse, which was super cool, and I was talking about my research on basically race and policing and criminal justice stuff. So kind of a different topic, but it went pretty well, and I got to swim with sea turtles and all kinds of other cool stuff. So it was good.
Did they pay for you to fly out there?
My university did, yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and chat was asking too. Kid Astro was asking, "Who are you?" Well, gosh, I guess you missed the first three parts. But Chris here
That
is
was
a
a good question.
researcher. Chris is a. Well, do you want to introduce yourself real quick then, for anyone who hasn't seen?
Yeah, sure. I ask that question all the time. It's like an existential crisis question, right? Like, who am I? So I'm a professor of psychology at Stetson University, and which is in Florida, and I've been doing research on video games for really kind of a long time now. It's probably been 20 some years that I've been doing video game research, mostly in the violent video game area. I've also done a little bit on other topics related to games, including a survey of GamerGate participants, which is where we ended up getting into contact with each other. And I do other things too. Like I said, I do research on race, policing, violent crime. I do a little bit on Dungeons and Dragons because there's a lot of kerfluffles over there as well. So yeah, that's about it. And I'm married and I have a 20-year-old son, and yeah, that's about it. Play a little guitar.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe at some point we'll talk about the guitar stuff. But right now we got two questions or two topics we want to get to before we jump into the GamerGate stuff. First topic, I guess we're just going to go over it, is you were invited to ALT+F4, the conference hosted by Paul Jawson and LTU, but they wouldn't accommodate your lodgings, last we heard.
Yeah.
So this conference, we've all talked about it. We've all seen it. Presumably, we've all seen it. A lot of people have expressed concerns. I've expressed concern.
Yeah.
Raymond Wallman's expressed concern. James Desborough has expressed concern. So has the Stardock CEO, Brad Wardell, and Brad Glasgow. They've expressed concern as well that the conference is seemingly entirely one-sided. Um, what do you think of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, to say I was invited, that makes it sound like it was like personal. I don't think I was personally invited. So I got an email basically that I think was a generic email. So I think it was kind of like sent to like, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it was sent to like hundreds of scholars, and it was very boilerplate. So it wasn't like a personal invitation, which is kind of like if you're a scholar in the field, submit something to give a little talk or have a poster or something like that. And then I just was like, I sort of wrote back saying, well, I don't know. It's in Detroit. I'm not like super excited. But I sort of said, well, I mean, if you pay me to go, then I'll go. I mean, and they probably asked the same thing as your listener. Who are you? So they didn't pay me to go. So yeah, it's in Detroit. Maybe Detroit's lovely. I've never been, but my prejudice, I guess, is that I'm not super excited to go to Detroit, and not pay for it at least. And yeah, I mean, my impression of the conference itself is it's definitely loaded in one direction as far as this issue goes, and even their description of the conference is pretty clear. The take that they take on it. So to be the odd duck out, to go to a conference and have a bunch of people scream at me because I didn't say the right thing, and to pay for it. If they're gonna pay me, it's different, But if I'm supposed to pay for it, they're like, nah. It just didn't seem that enticing. But yeah. So I mean, it's on GamerGate, and it really takes this position that I'm looking at the webpage now, and it says that in August of 2014, the hashtag GamerGag emerged online, used as a weapon deployed against women in the video game industry, and using online harassment tactics, blah 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 blah. So it's obviously very much into that particular narrative. It doesn't seem to be interested in, sort of a nuanced or objective take on GamerGate. Is very much according to a particular narrative, and I think that's what you're going to get if you go there. Is that it's kind of what we've been talking about. That one particular narrative that is on that academic left, I guess. So yeah. I don't know that anybody's paying attention to it, but but it's at a small university in Detroit. But it is what it is.
Well, I'm paying attention, and I'm going to
Yeah.
continue to talk publicly about their conference. Speaking of which, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. You know that a lot of us have reached out privately to the conference and publicly as well,
Hmm.
politely, just saying, "Hey, look, it's a little bit biased. We hope that you include a variety of perspectives." Um, Obviously, I'm not expecting you to disclose the private correspondence that you were CC'd onto. Uh, but how do
Yep.
you think? What do you think of their response in general terms, and what do you think of how we approached it, the GamerGate people?
Yeah, I mean, my impression of like game studies is that like a lot of things game studies changed over the last decade. So I remember like back in like the whole video game violence debate and the Supreme Court case in 2011 that like game studies really seemed to be where it was at. Like these were the rational people. It was the social psychologists who were crazy. That they were the ones that were big into this idea that like video games cause violence and this sort of stuff. But the game studies people who are from a different discipline, were much saner. I mean, they might have had a variety of opinions, but there wasn't this kind of like monolithic, video games are bad, sort of position. And it feels like there's been something of a cultural change within game studies over the last decade or decade and a half. Not that there aren't sane people, and there still are sane people, but there definitely is a subset of people who are very loud and very vocal and seem to have a lot of cultural impact that are, they tend to view themselves almost as under siege from gamers. So they really don't like gamers. They really buy the GamerGate narrative, from 2014. They're very quick to see themselves as victims. They think that like if GamerGate had only been stopped in 2014, then Trump wouldn't have been elected, and all kinds of other all that kind of stuff. We talked about that in other contexts on the show, but all that kind of stuff is like going on in that area, and they can be very nasty sometimes. I'm not naming any names or anything like that, but certainly my own experiences with them sometimes has been pretty unpleasant. And of course, game studies is part of a field called communication, and communication as a field tends to be one of the most left wing, even of academic fields. Even compared to like psychology or other fields, like they're really really. There are no Republicans, put it that way, like literally
Well,
zero.
I
In
just
that
want to
area.
interject really
So
quick to say that occasionally your audio is
yeah.
cutting in and out. It's like once every like 40 seconds or 30 seconds. Um,
Okay.
but I don't know if I got a storm going on too where I'm at, so it could be that the storm is
Okay.
just slowing down the Wi-Fi
I'm
for some
gonna
reason. But
I'm gonna bring my mic a little closer to me. Maybe that will help a little bit.
okay.
And maybe I'm just having too much fun and
Well,
swiveling in my chair too
so
much or something.
so the scientists in your view, some of them are biased, and they unfortunately have fallen for a false narrative. Um, but what do you think of how we've approached it? Because you've seen our responses too. You've seen my response, James's response.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fine. I think it's not going to change anything in the sense of they have this conference. It's obviously planned. they're not going to not do it. You know what I mean? And they're not going to change it. I don't think. But I think I think that it's good to critique it. And my intention too is probably to speak about this at some future point, as well. Um, it's kind of like with a lot of these situations, you can't. And I've learned this in other contexts too, that a group of people want to do a thing, you really can't stop them from doing the thing.
Well, we don't want to stop them.
Um,
All we want them to do is add diversity.
yeah, they're not going to do that. I can tell you that is never going to happen. Yeah, but I mean, what you can do is be another voice, for that, in a sense of, if all people see is this, then they may buy it. Although, I mean, again, I'm looking at their front page, and there's a lot of academic jargon in here that I think turns a lot of people off. But all that like heteronormative, hegemonic, blah blah blah. Um, but I think having other voices out there saying like, okay, this thing happened. Here's what they did. Here's what they said, and here are our concerns about it. I think that helps a lot. You know what I mean? I think that gives people a sense that this isn't the only voice, that there is other stuff going on. I mean, I've dealt with this with like the American Psychological Association with some of their public statements that I've learned the hard way, kind of like you're probably learning a little bit, that you just can't stop people from being stupid sometimes, and they're just going to ignore data. They'll ignore contrary voices, whatever. But you can speak out, and oftentimes by speaking out in parallel, you can draw eyes to something and get people to take a more skeptical look at it. And I think that's going to be very helpful here.
Yeah.
To
And
the
well, that's
extent
what.
that anybody's looking at it, that'll
So,
help.
so there's two things I want to talk about with this too before we move on to the next topic, which is like one of which is they seem to rely heavily on this idea that, oh, well, we did publicly put out a request if you want to send anything in, but you didn't do so. But if you look at how they publicly promoted that supposed request,
Yeah.
it was two tweets. As far as I can tell, they didn't even
Mhm.
post it on Blue Sky. Ironically enough, if they posted them on Blue Sky, I might have seen it. Uh,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
they only made it on Twitter. They made two tweets that got no views. They got like a few dozen views, I think. And like because it was a small account that made the it was their
Yeah.
personal account. Um,
Yeah.
it's like, well, this is, and you didn't even include the hashtag. You didn't even include hashtag GamerGate. And then clearly they've done legwork to reach out to a ton of people outside of their public request. So it's
Yeah.
not like, oh,
Mhm.
well, Anita Sarkeesian submitted her work through the public system after she saw a
Right.
tweet with
Right.
42 views. I doubt it.
Yeah.
Um, but they never reached out to anyone on our side. Like, what? Is that what
No,
they're
and
gonna
that's
go with basically as their excuse? Like, oh well, look, we tried to do diversity, but the GamerGate people never submitted anything.
yeah. That's a very common political way of doing things, right? Is it kind of like bury bury some sort of like public commentary somewhere, that nobody's going to actually see it, but then you can point to it and say, well, we kind of like advertise this thing. And it's the same thing. They'll be able to say, well, hey, look, we said Dr. Ferguson an eval. They did, right? But if you look at like how they advertised their conference, it's not going to be something I'm going to terribly be interested in going to, where they talk about all this like heteronormative, hegemonic discourses, and use very very one sided view. I mean, obviously they don't want me. I mean, I can tell from their cover page, that my view of things is not what they're looking for, and it's not going to be a lot of fun, right? I mean, what they do, of course, with like the featured speakers, I'm imagining. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that these people got like Anita Sarkeesian. I'm sure they pay her to go. I'm sure she's going to rake in some amount of money to end up headlining this particular conference. So I agree. I don't think she like was on Twitter and went, "Hey, I've been looking for a trip to Detroit. This is like a great
Hey,
opportunity."
the pizza's good
Uh,
there.
so I imagine like the headliners they reached out to and are probably paying a certain amount of cash to have them headline this event. But no, I think it's probably my impression of it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it'd be huge. I don't know. But I've never heard of this university before, and or this conference or anything. So I think they probably somebody there, struck gold and got a grant to put on some sort of conference, and locally, and they blew their cash on a couple big names, and then they're hoping a whole bunch of other academics will want to go, and it's kind of like getting together with a bunch of people who are like-minded, and that's fun, I guess, and then you sit around for a couple days drinking a lot of alcohol, and you talk about how everybody else that disagrees with you sucks. That's humans like to do that.
So these are
So
these are scientists, Chris. You're a scientist. They're
yeah.
scientists. Aren't they supposed to be guided by the truth?
Uh, yeah, theoretically. But we're social scientists, right? No, absolutely, we should, but this isn't new, right? I mean, you can look at a whole bunch of different issues, and you can see that, particularly in social science. Although you're right, I mean, the epitome even of social science is be as objective as possible. Um, a lot of social scientists aren't, right? And that's been true for video games for decades, right? I mean, yeah, like I said, going back to the social psychologists with video game violence, we've seen that, sort of bias problem, but we see that in other issues too. I mean, obviously, like I said, I do research on like race and policing, and that's an issue where there's a lot of bias. You can look at like, other like gender identity issues where, where there are moral narratives, and oftentimes these big sweeping moral narratives really interfere with the data, and the data almost become irrelevant, and people really spend more time talking about the moral narratives because the moral narratives make them feel like better people, kind of saying like, oh, issues of race are complicated and there are no good guys and no bad guys, and that kind of stuff is there's it's not really a morally, you don't get to win like the hero of the day, by saying that, but going to Detroit and saying we're here to defend women from these like neckbeard gamers, and kind of stuff. I mean, you feel like a good person, right? You may not actually be a good person, but you feel like a good person. And it's all about feels with these things. And, so
So
social scientists are, vulnerable to falling into these moral narratives even more than other groups of scientists.
so if you have, I know they're watching. Maybe not right now, but they're gonna watch later, almost certainly.
Mhm.
I, what message do you have for them? Um, my message is, hey, look, all we're asking for is a diversity of viewpoints. We have decided not to contact anyone superior at the university because we believe in academic freedom, or at least I do. Um,
Yeah.
and so, we've tried to approach you in good faith. We're trying to work within the system to reform it, or to not even reform it, but just like to get like accurate information out, and like a diversity of perspectives. That's all I'm asking for. That's all the people I've seen asking for. Just add diversity. That's all we ask. But what's your
Yeah.
takeaway? What's your message to them if they're watching?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, my two thoughts are, one, yes, it would have been a much better conference if they had been more open, clearer. And I mean, like on their facing page and that kind of stuff. If they've been much more curious about alternative views about GamerGate and evidence that suggests the narrative may be more complicated than what they would like to think. I think that would have made it a much better conference. I think it would have been more fun, more interesting, and people would have learned more. They should still have the people that they have, that have one particular view. That's fine. But it would have been great to diversify the perspectives a little bit, and that might have actually been, if there is this motive to actually improve dialogue on this area, then that would have been better, right? As opposed to getting a bunch of like-minded people together to drink alcohol and talk about how everybody else sucks, which is kind of what it sounds like they're doing
Well,
at
if
this
if
point,
they
right?
decide
You know?
to, unfortunately, I got a real life plan that same weekend. Already,
Yeah.
that's a major obligation. But assuming that doesn't fall through, if they decide to add diversity and they decide to move it to a different weekend, I can possibly do it.
Yeah.
Fly me out, of course. Uh,
Yeah.
I don't have I don't have the money to go to Detroit. Uh,
It's still in Detroit. Yeah, it's
uh,
it absolutely is. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think there was that. And what was the other thing I was going to say? I know I said I had two things, and now I've lost the second thing. Whatever. Oh, the second thing I was going to say was that the more you get the sense that you're like on the moral side of history
the less you probably actually are. You know what I'm saying? In a way, like the more you're patting yourself on the back for being the good guys, the more likely it is you're actually the bad guys. So that's just something to think about. That's kind of a lesson we should probably learn from history. A little bit is that maybe this isn't so great. I don't know.
Anything else you want to say about the conference before we move on to the protests?
No, I hope they have fun. I hope they drink a lot of alcohol and have a lot of fun.
I hope they reconsider their position to do a one-sided conference. Um, anyway, so you've been talking a lot on social media about the campus protests relating to the
Hmm.
Israel-Palestine war, the 2023 to 2024 Israel-Palestine war. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on that publicly?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I've been doing it on social media, sure. No, I've written on it a few times, for my Substack and stuff. Um, my sense is, so I mean, like everybody else, I mean, I have views of the war itself, but I think that the protests in many ways are not even terribly relevant to the war in either direction. They're not really having any impact on the war. And on the other hand, I don't know that the war is even really central to the protests in the sense that, if I was a Gazan, and I was hoping that some group of Americans would turn public opinion around on that issue and get more Americans to be on the side of the Palestinians. These students have been the worst allies possible. They have really not been effective in turning public opinion around the Israel-Palestinian crisis. But I don't. That's why I don't think that the protests are. I mean, they're ostensibly about Palestine, right? But I don't think, and this is my cynical worldview. I mean, I think it really is more local. That the protests reflect some structural problems in the U.S. And that are probably complicated, but the protesters are really, I mean, a lot of them obviously don't know a lot about Palestine, right? And the complicated history of that area, and so I think a lot of the motivation for what they're doing is about themselves more than it is about people in Gaza or people in Israel. And that it's attractive to feel like you're the hero, or you're on an adventure, or you can give a big middle finger to daddy or the man, or something of that sort. So I think you have these very elite, very wealthy students, in some cases backed up by sort of professional
Yeah,
agitators and
well,
things
some of
like
them
that.
might be scholarship students. I don't know, but
Oh, I'm sure they are. But I mean, think of it like 4 years ago. The same basic group of people was standing in line to wash the feet of black people, right?
were
And
they the
now here
same
we
group
have.
of people if it was 4 years ago and they're in university?
Yeah, I mean, some of them were at universities, absolutely, and some of them, of course, were in cities and in streets and that kind of stuff, right? But you had these like wealthy elite, white people, sort of like washing the feet of black people very ritualistically, and here 4 years later, the same basic group of people are now screaming in the faces of black people. You know what I mean? They whether those black people are janitors, whether they're cops, whether they're university provosts. So we can kind of, I mean, the cause is pretty vacuous. That like these people are not really super serious about the quote unquote the cause,
I
because they'll
saw.
just drop the cause. You
I've
know?
not seen every. I've not seen every video from every protest. I saw
Yeah.
when Destiny went to University of Austin. Have you seen that?
No, I have not. I've seen. They're all a mixing. University of
So
Austin or University of
University of
Texas
Texas
Austin. Is
Austin.
that
I think it
the-
was. I think it was
Yeah, yeah.
University of Texas Austin. So the protest there. If I'm mistaken, we can correct it. But please let me know, chat. But um, but he was there, and he went there. He's just like, hey, look, I'm gonna record it, and but
Yeah.
I'm gonna not edit any clips out. I'm gonna just record the full conversation as it is. I'm not gonna take it out
Yeah.
of context. And he didn't. And he recorded him talking with. He talked with a few of the students, but most of them wouldn't talk to him. In fact, one of the
Yeah.
organizers went around and was like, "Don't talk to him! Don't talk to him!" And
Yeah.
like, just like making this huge deal, and they were screaming, and they were trying to get all the other people to stop talking to him. And the first kid he talked to, who like seemed like he was a little bit more reasonable at first, um, He later got yelled at by one of the other
Yeah.
organizers for having a conversation about it. And
Yeah.
then he comes around and becomes like a big advocate. He goes around and becomes like the person who's trying to stop everyone else from talking now because he's like been shamed into it. And then
Yeah.
apparently he goes back by himself and just like sits by himself on his phone for
Yeah.
like the rest of the, well, not the rest of the time, but like for a while after that. So it's like he's not even
Yeah.
like, so it's like he got like demonized and shamed into silence
Yeah.
and into like this mob mentality.
Yeah. Well, so many of the protests are almost kind of, I mean, I hate to say it, but they're almost kind of funny to watch. I mean, they're actually kind of fun to watch, in a way. But that's not really the vibe you want, if you're trying to like, have a serious protest about something. Yeah, and the issue is very serious. So don't get me wrong. Again, I'm sort of separating out the issue in the Middle East from the actual protests here. So I'm in no way saying the issue is funny, but the way the protests are being conducted are oftentimes very funny. I mean, probably one of my favorite was, you might have seen this one. I forget which university was at, but this was actually when I was in Hawaii. So this is before like the really big outburst the last few weeks. But there was one conference, one university where students overtook part of a building, like a library or something like that, in a building, not the full building, but part of it. But they forgot to include a bathroom, in the part of the building they took over, which seems like a critical failure of strategy a little bit for me. But so they were peeing in bottles and all this kind of stuff, right? But they had one young woman who was on a period, and she had a tampon in. And of course, there's no bathroom, so she can't find a private place to change her tampon. And so they called 911, and I guess they wanted to get an ambulance there to like get the young woman out because they were afraid she was going to get toxic shock syndrome from not being able to change her tampon. And it was just so stupid.
Well,
It was really this is crazy.
we can sit here
Yeah.
and beat up on 18-year-old
Yeah.
college kids all day, but
Yeah.
let's talk about the war itself real quick. Got a couple questions
Yeah,
about
sure.
that before we move in. So the protesters, some of them at least, they claim that Israel is engaging in genocide against the Palestinians. What do you think of that idea?
I think like a lot of things. I mean, the word genocide is being misused a lot. I obviously don't think Israel's goal is to kill all the Palestinians, which is what a genocide, would be. If anything, Hamas is much more explicitly genocidal than is Israel. Now that doesn't mean that Israel is beyond critique, that they're not being callous, in some of their bombings. I'm open to those critiques of Israel, and certainly for civilians on the ground, the experience has got to be incredibly miserable. So I'm sympathetic, to that. I'm glad it's not happening in Orlando. I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea a lot of civilians are suffering in the situation, but it's not a genocide, because there's no obvious desire on the part of the Israelis to wipe out all of the Palestinians in Gaza. So I think these words, just like we've seen in the last few years, like racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all these other things, are getting misused and applied to situations where they really, really don't apply. And again, that's not to say that people can't critique what Israel is doing. But I think they're doing it in ways that are disingenuous, and that always has the risk of backfiring. So if you're not coming across as honest, about these things, then people are going to perceive that you're extreme, and they're going to be less sympathetic, to your movement. It doesn't matter what the issue is, whatever the issue might be. And so I think that the protest would probably be be better off, saying something to the effect of, we're really worried that Israel is being callous, in their bombing and are unnecessarily targeting civilians. And I think that would come across as more reasonable than all the talk about genocide, particularly when they're failing to note that part of the reason that Israel is bombing civilian centers is because Hamas is hiding their munitions and their command centers and things like that under civilians. And so I think that's also the missing part of the protest. That again, I think it's fair to critique Israel on some things, but the fact that they seem to not care about what Hamas is doing at all, and the role that Hamas is playing in ensuring explicitly. I mean, Hamas has just come out and said that our strategy is to make sure Israel has to bomb civilians. They've just come out and said it. You know what I mean? So that the protesters aren't able to criticize Hamas, and in some cases are glorifying Hamas. I think it's easy to dismiss that as misinformed at best and disgusting or anti-Semitic at worst. And so
All
I
right,
think
so
that's again where the protesters are
I want to do a speed round
using the
since I don't want
strategy.
to. I don't want to get too stuck on this. We've already gone 30.
Yeah.
Speed round. What do you think of the U.S. vetoing Palestinian statehood at the UN?
I mean, I think eventually the UN is useless. I mean, that's part of the problem here too. I no longer see the UN as being terribly effective at much of anything. So I imagine there probably are reasons why the U.S. did that. I think though realistically, the Palestinians and Israelis are both going to have to figure out some way to coexist in some kind of two-state, solution. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but that's my, certainly naive view of things. Is some kind of two-state solution is going to be the only way to resolve this. But how to get from here to there, I have no idea.
All right, so two
So.
more questions. One of which is, what do you think of the West Bank settlements that Israel has constructed?
Yeah. Ironically enough, I think that Israel is more open to critique on the West Bank than in some cases in Gaza. Again, that's not to say Israel is beyond critique in Gaza, but they had a very clear casus belli. They got attacked by Hamas out of nowhere, basically. Well, maybe not out of nowhere, but certainly a vicious attack on October 7th, and they had the right to respond. To that militarily. There's no question, I think, in that. Now whether they're responding callously is open to discussion. In the West Bank, I think the policies of Netanyahu's right wing government have been very unhelpful. So I'm more sympathetic to the idea that Israel's making things worse, for the region with their illegal settlements in the West Bank, and I wish they would withdraw from that, because I think there again, it's going to be a two-state solution, and the West Bank is part of that two-state, and I think Israel's going to have to accept that at some point.
Okay, and then one more
I'm here
thing,
to
which
fix
is,
everything. I'm going to fix the Middle East. There we go.
well, speaking of which, the last question on this before we move on is, green shoots for hope. What are you optimistic about regarding this conflict and regarding a two-state solution, since that's your preferred outcome?
Yeah. So I think what needs to happen is, yeah, and these are utopian, ideas. So I understand this is, may or may not happen in the near future. I think that the area would be much better off without Hamas. That's probably not a shocker. And would be better off without the Netanyahu government in Israel. And I think if we could get rid of both Hamas and Netanyahu, and other groups like the Houthis and the Houthis and the Hezbollah, all this kind of Iranian-backed groups. So we get rid of all of them and could get rid of the sort of right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel. I think there might be an opportunity to fix things. Now, what I think ought to happen in Gaza, this is where I say the UN is useless, right? All the UN does is criticize Israel, and that's fine. But they don't actually help, so it would be nice if the UN would, have some plan to step in and, send peacekeepers to Gaza and actually get rid of Hamas and rebuild Gaza as some kind of massive holiday resort, because it's in a beautiful area, right? It's on the, eastern.
Well, they got those beaches. You've seen them,
Yeah, I mean, it could be like a tourist mecca, if the UN would actually step in and take charge of Gaza and develop it, then that would be great. But the UN is not going to do it,
Well, honestly, the U.S.
Anyway.
might not be opposed to that.
Well, I think it would have to be like the UN that would do it, right?
No, I mean,
'cause
like the U.S. wouldn't veto it, probably. I don't know. We might not veto
Yeah.
that. I would hope we wouldn't veto that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I don't think so.
I gotta ask one more question because.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you can finish your point, and then.
Oh no, just real quick. I think the UN is just the same as like Egypt and Jordan and all the other countries in the area. Nobody wants to touch it.
Well, I think the UN would be willing, probably. It's because the UN does whatever the Security Council and the General Assembly want. Essentially, that is the role of the United Nations. So I think if I don't know. Let's see if that happens. Let's hope it does. Anyway, so you mentioned Hezbollah. One of the people I've interviewed is a supporter of Hezbollah, um, and at least believes that they. I don't want to like put words in her mouth. Cole Nasrallah, do you know her? She's a professor too.
I'm not familiar with the name. No, sorry.
Okay, so I've interviewed her. She is sympathetic towards Hezbollah, uh, and she recognized she says that they're a democratically elected political party within Lebanon, and
Okay.
that it should be something that the United States sees as a potential negotiating partner, possibly. And there's
Interesting.
also, I
Okay.
believe that several European countries actually do make a distinction between Hezbollah, the political party, and Hezbollah, the military group. They separate the two
Gotcha.
in
Okay.
terms of their terrorist designations.
Yeah.
What do you think of that argument?
Well, I guess they're trying to do like a Sinn Féin, IRA distinction, somewhat. I mean, complicated thoughts. I mean, I guess it sort of worked for Ireland, so I'm guessing they're trying something similar to that to kind of normalize the political wing and allow the military wing to wither off. And like I said, it worked for Northern Ireland, right? And whether that's a one-off or if it's an actual model that could work for Lebanon, I don't know. I'm not sure that the Lebanese would agree that Hezbollah is a democratically elected, representative group in Lebanon. But I don't know. Maybe I'm not Lebanese, so maybe I'm wrong, about that. But I'd be very interested to see, this particular, professor, it sounded like she's a woman.
Yep. Yeah.
If she would enjoy living in the areas that Hezbollah controls, or would enjoy living in Gaza under Hamas, necessarily. And I think that's also one of the things that gets lost in this whole, dialogue is that, the conditions in these areas culturally for women or gay people, are abysmal. And so it's sort of fascinating to watch people in the West, cheering on these organizations that would happily repress them if they actually tried to live in those areas of the world. So I don't know. I mean, like I said, I'm not a political scientist, so I have
Well,
opinions, but
Chris, if Professor Nasrallah is interested in discussing it with you, Israel-Palestine and Hezbollah, and possibly the Houthis too, would you be open to that conversation with me as a moderator?
yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, to be upfront with that. It'd probably be I don't know if is she a political scientist or is she just
She's
another.
a philosophy professor.
Okay, yeah, yeah. It's probably a good conversation for. I mean, I know some of the stuff about what's going on in the area and some of the cultural stuff too.
Well, it doesn't
It
have to
might
be
be
a debate. It could be a friendly discussion exploring,
yeah, sure. I mean, I'm open to the idea. Yeah, just with the caveat that unlike the game stuff, I'm just a dude who watches the news and takes some interest and can read things.
All right. Well, hey,
And I like history, but I'm not a political scientist.
speaking of the game stuff, let's get to it. All
Yeah.
right. So where we left off, I just asked you the last question I asked you was about if you were the editor in chief. Next question up in games journalism is: do you think there is still a role for good games journalism in the world, and what does that look like to you?
Oh yeah, I think so. There just isn't any. That's the problem. Yeah, no, I think there definitely would be. I mean, it was like I said. I mean, my experience of it was awesome. Back prior to say 2011 or so, that there actually was some good stuff being done in games journalism, and you sort of going through the whole like video game violence issue and the Supreme Court decision in 2011. It actually was pretty nice, having games journalism talking about those issues, kind of taking the perspective of gamers. And so I think that, fulfilled a valuable function. It, addressed a particular audience that didn't really have a voice anywhere else. And it's a shame that we've kind of lost that to a large degree, and now the audience is less gamers as opposed to people that got bachelor's degrees in the humanities, so it'd be nice to see. And it's okay if there's one or two outlets for those folks too, right? But it'd be nice if there was a variety of outlets, so that some were actually addressing gamers as an audience as opposed to humanities graduates as an audience, which is, I think, where the field has drifted off to.
All right.
How's my sound, by the
Some
way? Does it sound better
it's a
now?
lot better, yeah.
Yeah.
Some
Okay.
yeah, I don't hear it cutting out as much or at all recently. I don't think. Some
Good.
GamerGate supporters believe that pressuring advertisers to pull out would be a good way to convince gaming publications to initiate ethical reforms. What did you think of this strategy?
I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it. I mean, various types of boycotts and stuff. That's not a new approach that people have used over time. It's basically voting with your wallet. Saying we're no longer going to buy your products if you keep supporting blah 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 blah. And that's a legitimate consumer strategy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It seems like games journalism is able to persevere through a lot of really bad trends. So, I see a lot of these layoffs and pullbacks from a lot of these outlets and stuff. So it doesn't look to me, again, I'm not super well informed, but it doesn't look to me like games journalism is doing terribly well already. But they still are persisting on whatever the hell it is that they're doing. So I'm not, sometimes boycotts work, sometimes they don't. We've, historically boycotts have, in the last 10 or 20 years at least, boycotts have not been super effective. So we've seen like conservatives boycotting Disney and things like that, and most of those didn't really work out,
Well, what
terribly
about Bud
well.
Light?
Well, that's what I was going to say. All of a sudden, the last like 2 years, we've had Bud Light, we've had Target, we've had Gillette. We've had a number of situations where these boycotts seem to have actually worked, and I think that part of that is conservatives on many of these more recent issues were able to pull in moderates and like independents into it as well. Like a wider range of people got frustrated. And boycotts also tend to work when you have choices, right? So like I don't know, does anybody really love Bud Light? I don't know. What I mean? Like there's other beers, what I'm
Some
saying,
people drink it, yeah. But
Yeah,
well,
no, I'm
I
not
should
saying it's like
yeah.
terrible,
I
but
worked in retail in the past. I actually used to work at Target.
yeah.
I'll disclose that. It's not gonna like come up because it's not my current
Yeah.
job. But I guess transparency. I'm trying to be more open about my life too.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I revealed my face yesterday.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, in the Murkoff to
People
Perk
didn't mind
interview.
screaming. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
in September 2014, it was revealed that nearly 150 games journalists from competing publications were in a mailing group called Game Journal Pros. What did you think of this revelation?
Yeah, I think I remember like I think Jesse Singal and Katie Herzog were talking about that somewhere on one of their podcasts. Just recently, in fact. And I mean, I think probably like these kind of listservs are kind of typical. Like we have these in academia too, although I've taken myself off of most of them because they were just annoying. But sometimes you see people that are in the same field, have like interests, will get together in these listservs. But I think it had a sense that which can happen, created a kind of a sense of groupthink, right? And so you ended up with a narrative, and people were maybe pushing each other to support that narrative and only publish, along that narrative. So I think that maybe is the downside of that. I mean, people have the right to do it. We can't stop people from doing it. But you may end up with a situation where there's social pressure that ends up reducing people's ability to think independently. I mean, the nice thing about journalism, right, is if everybody's supporting a particular narrative, that you get the one, guy or gal who says, "Well, let me look deeper. Let me kick the tires of this narrative, and maybe it's different from what everybody's saying." And if you're in a listserv with a bunch of your colleagues, then they're all saying you're a bad person if you dare to question the narrative, then you may get less of that, right? And I think that's, it's been the problem with journalism in general over the last 10 to 15 years is where I think we saw a lot more conformity in journalism, and that peaked in 2020, but had been going on for a while. And now we're starting to see some tire kicking a little bit, but yeah, I think that probably was an unintended negative impact on the willingness of journalists to question the popular narrative.
Do you have any thoughts on deep freeze?
What is deep freeze? I do not.
Oh
What is deep
my
freeze? Tell me what it
gosh,
is.
how do you not know what deep freeze is? Okay.
I'm very parochial.
All right.
I
I'm
know
gonna
the things
tag
I
you,
don't know.
Avalon God. There you go. There's the link to deep freeze.
Oh, where is this? Oh, where did you put it? Where did you put it in the
In
general
the
thing
general,
here?
in general, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let me scroll down here. Okay, deep freeze. Let's see. Visit site. What is deep freeze? Oh, I have to read all this. I'm under so much pressure. Your trust should be your limit journal scandals. Okay, comes to video game journalism. Okay. So give me a 50-second version. This is gonna take me an hour to read all this.
All right. So it's basically a catalog of various ethical issues in games journalism, as well as if
Yeah.
they've issued corrections or not with the various issues.
Okay, gotcha. So it's sort of like a watchdog,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good. I mean, it's good to have watchdogs, right?
I agree.
Yeah, and because that's the sort of thing. I mean, the only thing that changes, people's behavior, is deterrence. Really, I mean, I talk about this in criminal justice all the time, right? So if you have and I see the same thing going back to this conference, right? I mean, the only thing that changes, the Detroit conference we've been talking about, the only thing that kind of changes people's behavior is if they're rewarded for something, they're going to keep doing it, right? And if you, I'm going to use the word punish. I don't mean it like their school children need a spanking, but if you have some sort of like punishment for a behavior, then you're going to get less of that behavior, right? So if there are these scandals, if journalists are saying things that aren't true, that they're not doing their job very effectively, then calling them out and embarrassing them is deterrence. I mean, as long as it's true, as long as it's accurate, then that's what gets people to change. I mean, I think the reason I just said that I'm more optimistic about journalism in general in 2024 than I was in 2020, a lot of that was because journalists from 2020 to 2023 got ridiculed a lot, for publishing, very, left-wing narratives that oftentimes weren't true. And to the extent that other people were able to point that out in public and sort of embarrass or humiliate those journalists, I think that has helped journalists and their editors become more effective at fact checking, at covering both sides, at not simply regurgitating the same narrative over and over again. So I think that is helpful to have these kind of outlets.
All right. In August 2015, Michael Koretsky, a regional director for Society of Professional Journalists, hosted the SPJ Airplay conference. The idea of the conference was to have journalistic ethics experts meet with GamerGate supporters to discuss their concerns about games journalism and the way the media covered GamerGate. The second half of the conference was interrupted by bomb threats, forcing the convention center to be evacuated. Do you have any thoughts on this event?
That sucks. I mean, obviously, but you see this also. Oddly enough, all the stuff rings like I know of other examples of this happening. Essentially, that it's funny how you will get this sort of situation where people are upset about violence or aggression, and then they'll use violence or aggression to stop you from saying anything that is unflattering for their movement. And the one example I can think of, that, like when you said that about the conference, this is going back to the 70s or late 70s, early 80s, somewhere in there. And there was a conference on domestic violence. And there were some Susan Steinmetz, I think, was the researcher. There was a woman researcher who was going to present on domestic violence. And what she was basically going to present on was research suggesting that women engage in domestic violence as often as do men. And she was prevented from speaking because of a bomb threat at the conference center. So same basic thing So when you said that, that's what I thought of. So yeah, that is a fairly common tactic, apparently, that you basically have a moral narrative about aggression or violence, and somebody is challenging that narrative. And for some reason, you use a threat of violence in order to stop them from with no irony, right? It's sort of a really lack of insight strategy here, somewhat. So I don't think that approach works. I mean, so if anybody out there is listening and thinking like, oh, there's going to be this conference and I really don't like it, let me call in a bomb threat. First of all, you might get arrested, and that's a pretty serious charge.
Let me just say now, nobody should do that with the ALT+F4 people. I absolutely
Absolutely.
disavow I found out that anybody tried something like that, I'm going to report them to the police.
Write an op-ed. Write an op-ed. That's okay.
Yeah. But I don't think anybody.
Yeah.
I don't think any GamerGate people would do that. I don't think anybody in my community would do that.
Yeah, absolutely not. Do not.
If we were the victims of bombs,
bad.
not the other way around.
Don't do this. So absolutely do not do it. We condemn it. Absolutely unqualifiedly condemn any threats or actual acts of violence towards anybody. It does not improve things at all.
Anyway, the more you talk about it, the more likely it's going to happen. So
I know. Okay.
So what are your not from my actually not with my community, I don't think. But obviously this is public information. Anybody anywhere in the world could see this. Anyway, Chris, the bomb threats are bad. I agree. Any thoughts on the actual substance of the conference, the first part or the second part?
Well, I mean, it sounded good. I mean, I think that if you have opportunities to bring people together, I mean, and I think this is we're still picking on this LTU conference a little bit, right? It's a missed opportunity, right? That any chance you have the opportunity to bring people together, whether it's gamers versus feminists, or if it's Gazans and Israelis, or Russians and Ukrainians. Any chance you get to bring people together that are in conflict and bring them together to talk, and they're willing to talk to each other, right? This is a good thing, right? It doesn't always solve the problem. I don't want to be utopian about that, but getting people into the room together to talk through their differences is a wonderful thing, and that's how we prevent conflicts, at least sometimes. Yeah, sometimes, the talks don't always work, but you have an opportunity there to do that, So I think it sounded great. I mean, the way you described it, bringing back people that are concerned about GamerGate, along with GamerGate, supporters, they're not going to get along right at the beginning, but if they're open to hearing each other out, they might find some common ground. They might be able to agree on things.
Well, none of the people none of the panelists were anti-GamerGate. The anti-GamerGaters refused to come. So it was just it was all they were just ethics experts, like Lynn Walsh, Derek Smart, a game developer, and then Lynn Walsh is an Emmy award-winning journalist, former SBJ president, and Ren LaForme of the Pointer Institute. They weren't anti-GG, though I think Ren might have been slightly more sympathetic towards the anti-camp, but he still went anyway, which I appreciate him doing.
Sure. But anti-GamerGate people, you should go to these things. I mean, and you might find that gamers aren't so bad, right? And maybe that's what they're afraid of. Because it's easy to dehumanize people when you don't have to to see them. But I definitely would say, so. Next year, if there's a GamerGate conference, it's too late for the one in September. But next year, make some real effort to reach out across.
Why do you say it's too late? I'm still optimistic they're going to change their mind.
Oh, I'm cynical. I don't think they're going to have to change everything that they did. Like
just
I said,
just bring in 4 new people. That's all. I don't keep it all the same, but bring in 4 people who disagree. That's all they got to do.
Yeah. No, that'd be great. I mean, I'd love to be.
But make sure they're try to add diversity, and make sure you don't try to pick people who are smart, I guess, too, but who actually know what they're talking about. But even if they had someone who's a rando, I tweeted about GamerGate 12 times, in support, even if that person would probably do a better job than most of the people at the conference. But obviously try to get an actual expert, get me, or not, well, if you move the conference date, get me, or get Grim Jim or somebody like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I sent you a list of suggestions, or just look through the people I've interviewed and see who seems interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it would be much more interesting, with some variety, and especially if you get people that don't want to just scream at each other, but that actually are sort of open to dialogue. Then I think that's what makes these things interesting.
Why do you think the media largely didn't cover SBJ or Play?
I think the media had its narrative already set, and it didn't want to complicate it, So I can tell you firsthand that when the media has a narrative on something, it doesn't like to mess with it. And I'm talking news media here, right?
Oh, I know. I've reached out to scores and scores and scores of journalists who got the story wrong, and none of them will talk to me. None of them. Yeah, zero. Zip. Nada.
Yeah, and I think there are various reasons for that. I mean, they have a sense of what sells. right? So they're going to create what sells. And nuance does not sell. It's just a general gist of things, right? Um, and if it's a moral narrative, again, this is a bigger issue of the last 10 to 15 years than it was before. But if there's a moral narrative, then, journalists are humans too. They don't want their own moral worldview to be questioned, So I think there's a general, just kind of human stubbornness that comes along with a lot of this sort of stuff. And so sometimes what you have to do is, if you're like looking at like the New York Times, whatever, like you say, well, the New York Times got this wrong, how can I, sort of challenge this with them? Let me write an op-ed. Maybe they'll publish my op-ed. Well, they probably won't. It's the reality of it. But you may be able to find another outlet, like a competing outlet that hasn't taken that hard line of a stance yet. And I mean, you could go the complete opposite direction and say, well, maybe like Fox News, sure. But you could like shoot for something in the middle too, like, Wall Street Journal or The Hill or something of that sort that's a little bit more neutral. So sometimes you can kind of work around, one outlet by finding competing outlets that are more open to, contrarian narratives, if you will. And I've had some success with that, that has worked, but sometimes saying, "Hey, you guys got this wrong. Would you like an op-ed that criticizes your article?" The answer is usually no, basically. But there again, and that's kind of like that workaround sort of thing, right? That you can still affect change by working around wherever the roadblocks are sometimes, and it just takes a little bit of effort and patience to figure out how to do that.
Do you have any thoughts on the Save Point panel at South by Southwest or my GamerGate panels at Arch Anime and NatsuCon?
Oh God, this is going back a long time. These were all anti-Gamergate panels, right?
No,
If I
these were
remember
well.
right.
If I hosted it, probably not. But
Yeah.
no. These were well. So I tried to be fair in mine, and obviously I was pro
Yeah.
DC, but I
Okay.
tried to present like a more neutral narrative. I think I don't know. I mean, I don't remember too much of it to be honest. But
Yeah.
like that's my personality, I guess. So I probably tried.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the Save Point panel was like it was pro and pro people and neutral people, so it wasn't
Well,
exclusively
that's
pro.
good.
It was a mix.
Yeah. I mean, it's good to have the variety. I think that's
Did you
helpful.
see the
Yeah.
Save Point one at South by Southwest?
No, I did not. No. This what year was that?
I think it was 2016, I believe. It was like right. It was the
2016.
year
Yeah.
after Airplay, I believe. I could be
I
mistaken.
wasn't at that point. I wasn't follow. I mean, I knew what GamerGate was. I was kind of like distantly following it. I wasn't following all the ins and outs of it at that point yet. Um, and I know we talked about this before. Like, kind of my path on GamerGate sort of changed over time. And like in 2014, 2015, I kind of was largely sympathetic, particularly to Anita Sarkeesian, and then by view of things. And I think some of that's her fault. But my view of things changed, and but I don't think I wasn't really paying a whole lot of attention to it at that point. Other than I knew it was a thing, I knew it existed. I wasn't like wound up in it too much. So I wasn't following all the ins and outs of like the back and forth of that sort of stuff. Really wasn't until when did Brad and I start working on our study? I can't even remember. But not until like the last 5 years that I kind of came back around in it. It was really a slow process. I started thinking like, and like I said, a lot of it was Anita's fault. I think, and I say fault because her videos got wilder and wilder, and
What was her fault
more.
specifically?
Well, I think like her initial video, the women versus tropes, I always thought was pretty good. I don't agree with everything that's in it, but I thought she was pretty level, in that first one. And maybe some of you listeners disagree with me. That's fine. But I thought she had some fair points, about old video games and like the way that women were represented in them or female characters. Um, but she kind of had this stance of like, well, but games are fun. We can enjoy games. We don't have to like say that they're like dooming the world. And like that was cool, and I thought she had some fair points. And her second video was pretty good too. And then kind of gradually she shifted into games really are dooming the world. Like she made more and more causal claims that I recognize were not supportable in the data, whether that was about like sexual content, body image, whether that was about violent content or whatever. So she seemed to go further and further down the rabbit hole over time and which I think a lot of activists do. Uh, and so I got kind of turned off by that. I remember she actually created I think it was some sort of like educational program, I think for like high schools or something of that sort. And I read through that at one point. I went, "Oh my God, this stuff is awful. What happened, Anita? What happened to you?" Kind of a thing. And so I got disillusioned with that view over time, and I actually met. And I can't remember the person's name. There was another person that worked at Feminist Frequency, a trans woman, who I met at a games conference in Cologne, Germany, and it was the same kind of thing. Like the message was a very, and I believe that she really believed what she was saying, and that's fine, that was great, but it was very moral narrative about the patriarchy and male privilege and all this kind of stuff. And like, yeah, this I think feminist frequency kind of became a sort of a cliche to some extent, and that really kind of sort of turned me off, about it. But that was kind of like my narrative, and so that's what kind of with some of those experiences, what kind of brought me back around. And said, huh, I sort of bought this, 5 years ago, or maybe a little bit longer, and now you're saying things I know aren't true about research data. Now I'm sort of curious about what you said about GamerGate in a larger sense, and maybe some of those things weren't that true either. I don't know, and that's what kind of got me interested in looking at sort of the events, and I find like the history of GamerGate to be kind of mind numbing in the sense of like there's so much back and forth, and nobody agrees what happened when and where, and even when Brad and I were writing the paper, it was very difficult, I think, for us, or at least it was for me. Maybe Brad feels differently. To sort of talk about the history of it, because it's just such a mess, in a way. And if you say anything, that some group of people are going to be mad. They're going to say, "No, that's not the way it happened." Like, I don't know. I'm just doing the best I can. Nobody agrees. And what happened? But yeah, that's kind of how things went with that. But yeah, so I wasn't really following a lot of the stuff that was going on in like 2016 or so. I was still, more into the violent video game debate at that point. So
Awesome. Have you seen the recently released Airplay documentary?
no, I have not. I've heard of it, but I have not seen it yet.
Okay.
Is it good?
Yeah, I think it's good. The first part, everyone agrees the first part's amazing. Even the anti-Gamergate people were really positive on it, actually.
Gotcha.
The second part, he goes a bit more into like the culture war aspects, and that's where some people disagree.
Yeah.
But I think he sticks very closely with the facts and tries to use primary sources where possible. I think he did a good job. I didn't notice anything that was factually inaccurate. I think
Yeah.
that he doesn't like offer his opinion per se because it's a lot of it's work. It's other people's words that he edited, using like fair use content and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think he draws a bit more of a culture war conclusion, which is understandable. I've
Yeah.
drawn some culture war conclusions too. My first book was Gamergate First Battle the Culture War,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I do think that I don't always agree with all of his conclusions. I think, but that's less to do with the documentary and more to do with conversations I've had with him outside of that. I would say it's a good documentary.
Okay.
I'd recommend talking. I'd do it, and he'd probably talk with you too. If you're willing to. He's trying to do a media tour of himself. Or, well, he's trying to promote the project, and one thing he's doing is
Yeah.
he's been going on shows recently and stuff.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. That's the way to do it. Absolutely.
All right. Well, do you have any thoughts on the Kunkel Awards?
Remind me what those are. See, these are all the inside baseball things I don't know. What was the Kunkel Awards?
So after Airplay, the
Yeah.
SPJ, Lynn Walsh and Koretsky, I believe both were pushing for this pretty hard. But they created an awards to promote good games journalism and to reward. Yeah.
Okay.
So
That
yeah,
sounds great. Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah. I mean, that goes back to my comments about like incentives, right? That you can either reward or punish things, right? Essentially, and figuring out ways of rewarding what you want to see and punishing what you don't want to see, is kind of how things work. Now, I'm not saying, to be clear, when I say punish, I don't mean like cancel or try to get people's jobs or or get people fired or things like that. But in terms of giving people rewards for good journalism, declining to click on links when you know that it's clickbait or rage bait stuff. I mean, that's all fair game. Taking your business away is really what I mean by punishment here. Again, not doxing people or that kind of stuff. But no, I think that's great. I think that's again is how you incentivize people is you give them something that they want for producing the content that you want, which oftentimes is just money, but rewards will do it too. And you don't give them the things that they want when they produce garbage, which again is usually your money, or you can do like what they used to do with like the Razzies, right? The Razzie Awards and that kind of stuff. I always sort of mused on this idea of doing the what I used to call the Wortham Awards. I never did it, obviously, because it's just a thing I'm used to. It was basically an award for the person who is promoting the biggest moral panic in any given year, named after Frederick Wortham, who thought that comic books caused delinquency and homosexuality back in the 50s. But I never actually done it, and I don't think I would. Yeah, that's the kind of things that motivate people, right? Is some kind of tangible response to what they're doing, and journalists, and ultimately want to make money. All these outlets want to make money, so the extent that you can help them make money by producing the kind of content you think you want to read, that's what you're going to get. And if you don't do anything and you keep rage clicking on, Kotaku articles that hate gamers, then you're going to get more articles that hate gamers. So stop clicking on those things, and you get fewer of them. Basically, don't rage click. That's the lesson here. Don't rage click.
Some GamerGate supporters say that they got involved to advocate for what they saw as artistic freedom, the right of artists to make the art that they want without fear or censorship or shoddy localization. Do you have
Mhm.
What do you think of this aspect of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going on in a few different areas, right? I mean, there really are sort of two things that we generally think drive good art, and one of that is as you're talking about is the creativity of the artists themselves and giving them the freedom to explore things that are interesting, that are pushing boundaries, that are making us think, that are challenging prevailing narratives and such. And the second thing is the market, right? That content producers are going to have to produce the content people want to buy. And that's just the reality of it as well. And we kind of accept those two things, right? That there should be this sort of large freedom for content producers to produce content, but that should be guided by the market to some extent. What we don't want is like political commissars, who are telling us you can't say this, you can't produce that, you must produce things in a certain way. And I think we're seeing this with video games. We're seeing this certainly with Dungeons and Dragons, where there's been a lot of that recently. We've been seeing it with movies to some extent, and there again, I think that for much of this, the arc has been positive over the last couple of years. Certainly with movies, I think we're seeing audiences pushing back against garbage. I think we're seeing that with video games too. Unfortunately, less so with Wizards of the Coast at the moment. But I think ultimately people aren't going to buy crap. And there's the whole narrative is the a get woke, go broke thing. I think things are a little bit more complicated than that. But in general, if you have a mid quality movie and you make it political, then I think that's a net negative, right? And I think we're seeing that work its way out now, that audiences don't want to be lectured to for the most part. And so no, I think that's good. I mean, I think we should be pushing for creative freedom and to let the market dictate what is successful and what is not successful, rather than forcing everyone to watch. Again, I'm always picking on these like people with bachelor's degrees in humanities, but what they think that we should watch. So hopefully this positive trend in the last year or two will continue.
You mentioned the Wizards of the Coast thing. What do you mean? The cuts
So,
notes?
Jesus Christ, there's a whole thing there with Dungeons and Dragons. Again, sort of emerged in the same period, like everything else. It kind of came out of the mid 2010s, of the idea that like D&D is racist, that having evil monsters is racist, that if you portray orcs as inherently evil, that this is somehow relevant to racism in real life, and all of that, and the D&D system, which has a lot of other controversies too. This isn't the only thing that's sort of controversial in Dungeons and Dragons. They've sort of moved in the direction of, they don't use I think in the newest edition, they're not going to use the word race anymore. They're going to use species. I don't know why that's better, but whatever. But they're kind of like trying to make it sound like, well, hey, not all of the monsters are evil anymore. It's all nuanced and this kind of stuff, and I think that has in many ways sort of kowtowed to this, narrative again on the sort of extreme left, the very loud voices on Twitter and other places. Pathfinder took slavery out of the game entirely because I think literally one person got mad about slavery or something. It's been really ridiculous. It's all the moral panic shit that happened in the '90s with Satanism and D&D. Just now it's with the left and it's with race and all that kind of stuff. Even though, and I've actually done some studies on D&D, and there's no evidence that playing Dungeons and Dragons is related to real life racism. Most people don't think evil orcs are offensive. Even most people of color don't think that evil orcs have anything to do with racism in real life. They're not worried about it. You can look at the images of orcs, and I just published a study recently on this. The images of orcs, either in D&D or in Lord of the Rings, are not based on racist stereotypes. So there's just nothing there, and the Wizards of the Coast should have just said to these loud people on Twitter, screw yourselves. There's just nothing there. We're just going to keep making the game the way that most people want to play it. And if you want to play it differently, that's great, but we're not going to like change the entire way that we talk about orcs, Unfortunately, that's not what happened. and unfortunately, that Wizards of the Coast kind of kowtowed to that sort of moral narrative once again. They've made some changes that have been controversial to some of their descriptions of monsters and other changes to the game. They've taken I think they're planning to take like half races out, like half elves or half orcs or that kind of stuff are going to go. I mean, it hasn't been released yet, so we'll see. These are all rumors about what they're going to do. And there again, I mean, I think that what they don't realize is that by giving in to these loud minority advocates, I don't mean like racial minorities, but I mean like literally like minorities in the community, that they're going to get more of it, right? Because that particular group of people are never happy. They're always going to move the goalposts, and there again, at some point, this is going to look bad. And I think it already does look bad.
So,
and I'll be very curious to see what happens with the D&D system. How many people actually move to this new edition, if it's financially successful. Wizards of the Coast, I think in December, laid off a huge percentage of the people that work on the D&D system, which is a weird thing to do when you're about to release a new edition.
is this the fifth edition?
It's going to be I don't know. See, that's the thing. Nobody knows what to even call it. It's essentially like 5.5, but they're kind of like saying it's not really a new edition. It's sort of a new edition. I don't know what to even call it. Nobody knows what to call it. But they're making these changes. But they're also trying to hyper monetize the system. They're trying to put it all online as opposed to in the book. I mean, you still be able to buy the books, of course, but they're there's a whole bunch of stuff that is going on with it. People haven't been very happy about. So it's been a really terrible rollout. Like I said, the marketing for it has been really, really bad. Nobody knows even what to call it. Is it a new edition? Is it not a new edition? What the hell is it? Even it's been the worst rollout of a D&D edition or not edition that I've ever seen, and I'm including 4th edition, which was terrible in my opinion. So I don't know. We'll see maybe they're geniuses and they'll make a lot of money, and I'm just an idiot. I don't know, but I've just never seen a clumsier rollout of a D&D edition before, and I can say I'm probably not going to move on. I'm sticking with 5th edition, which was fine. But we'll see what happens with it.
What do you think about arguments that video games can cause or reinforce? Actually, let me ask you about the custode thing. Have you followed that Warhammer 40K custode controversy?
I have not. I've seen some talk about it online, a little bit. My sense of it was that it was sort of parallel to a lot of the stuff that's going on in D&D, actually. But what exactly is going on
Well,
with Warhammer?
super quick. I'm not a Warhammer expert, but they decided, Wizards did, to release female custodes. Custodes are these special warriors, um,
Yeah.
Adeptus custodes they're called,
Hmm.
and I believe they guard the Emperor. I could be
Okay.
mistaken. Yeah, they guard the Emperor's palace and his physical body.
Yeah.
They also sometimes work on other missions as well. But they added female custodes, which angered some people who thought that they shouldn't be female custodes. That's not in the lore in their
Right.
view. But now that they're adding them, it's now canon that they are.
Gotcha. Well, it does sound sort of similar, in the sense of, I generally don't have any problem with adding, female characters to lore that didn't have it before. I mean, actually, but that's also because I'm usually not that invested in the lore in the first place. But like for instance, with the Hobbit movies that came out probably like 10 or some years ago, right? There was some controversy over what the hell is her name? Tariel or whatever it was, the female elf in the Hobbit movies who wasn't in the books. And or the book, and I loved her. I thought she was great, but I also didn't really enjoy reading The Hobbit. So, so I didn't really have any real investment in that. So I'm not opposed to, like, obviously adding female characters. I think sometimes that can be pretty awesome. But also I think that there's always a risk, right, for companies when you take something that has lore and you change it, because rather than creating new content, right? Uh, um, and an example of this is like the whole thing over like the Little Mermaid, the live action Little Mermaid, right? Obviously it's great to have more movies that feature black actors, right? In this case, Disney didn't do that though, right? They took a pre-existing franchise and changed the race of the actress, even though the story comes from Denmark. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of like feels cynical a little bit, and I think audiences are sort of catch that rather than taking folklore from Africa and telling a new story with a black actor or actress, which would be wonderful. You're taking a pre-existing franchise and sort of they call it race swapping, right? Sort of race swapping things out. Then that's gonna feel. I mean, it's gonna be very culture wars sort of stuff. You're gonna get a group of people who think it's great because they feel moral about thinking it's great, but you're gonna get a bunch of people who are gonna point out like this feels cynical. It feels like you're just doing it, in order to make a moral point rather than to tell a good story. So I'm guessing that, again, I don't play Warhammer either. I don't know much about it. But I'm guessing that's probably what some of the players are picking up on is like, you're doing this not because it's helping the story, but because you're trying to be woke, for lack of a better way of putting it, and I think it's difficult for content producers to get some of that stuff right, because you could probably think of some examples where a story makes it to the movie, and in the book, the character was white, but in the movie the character's black, and it's still an awesome movie, right? It still comes out
Well,
pretty good.
I've actually been
You know,
watching the Three Body. I've read the books, but I've been watching the
yeah,
show. I just finished the first season. Oh, it's they're only one season now, but
yeah,
it's really good. But they actually changed a lot of the characters because it's written by a Chinese author. Have you
yeah.
read the books or?
I read the first book and I am just starting to watch the series. So don't tell me too much about
Oh,
it.
okay. Well, never mind. But like, I'll just say this: I really enjoyed it. But
It was mostly set in
they
China, now it's set in England, right? That's
yeah,
kind of like what, yeah,
mostly in the UK. And they made a lot of the characters who were Chinese, white or black.
yeah.
Which
How dare they?
I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah,
It doesn't really bother me really, but like, they did actually whitewash the characters, I guess.
yeah. I know that's usually goes the other direction at this point. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And I actually thought that too. I would have been fine if they just kept it
yeah,
in
I would be
China.
fine if
Yeah,
they kept them
yeah.
Chinese. You know, I would have been fine if they kept the characters Chinese and made it. Well, in the books they're set all over the world,
You're right.
but mostly
Yeah,
China.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to say. I mean, I think what people pick up on is not that, look, if you want to tell the story differently, and of course, there have been plenty of examples in the past where stories that did come from other places were, as you said, whitewashed, and they put white actors in, and it's fair to criticize that too. I think, I think as long as there's no double standard, I think is what people pick up on is the idea of the double standard. That like if there's a sense that you could take like a Danish story and put a black actress in it, I actually don't care. I mean, I don't. I mean, I'm not the audience for The Little Mermaid anyway. It's not something I'm like staying up nights worrying about. But is it okay if you take an African story and then retell it with a white actress? So it has to be okay in both directions, right? You know what I mean?
agree.
Or it has to be not okay in both directions. What audiences will pick up on is if there's a double standard, and that can make things worse. Like if your goal is to like improve race relations, having a double standard is the opposite of what will improve race relations. So it has to be equal opportunity. If you're going to say, hey, look, any actor or actress of any race can play any role, hey, that's great. That's fantastic. Then let's do that. I'm open to that. But it has to be in all directions. Same thing, like we had like Tom Hanks come out and saying that he wouldn't do Philadelphia again. If he had to do it all over again, saying this idea that you have to be gay to play a gay man. That's crazy. Gay men play straight men on movies all the time. You know what I mean? So and that's fine. It's the being exactly from that race or ethnicity or that sexuality or whatever else. I don't know that that's what we want to do, is to silo actors into their own identities. It's acting. People are supposed to play different things, but we just have to make sure that it's open to everybody, right? So it's not all in one direction. And I think it's what some audience is picking up on. And of course, it's easy then to cast them as racist. Oh, so you're racist if you don't, or you're sexist if you don't like women in Warhammer, right? I don't know. Maybe some people are, but I think other people are just sort of picking up on this sense that there's some kind of double standard to play.
Chat saying don't simp for it too much. It's a good show. I like it. So far, I like the books too. Except for the ending. The ending is well, the ending of the books.
Don't tell me the ending. Don't tell me the ending.
I'm not gonna tell you that. But
I didn't like it when the turned out the butler did it. Kind of stuff.
All right. So, what do you think about the argument that video games cause violence? Because I just asked you about sexism earlier, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, this is what I cut my teeth in this area, right? That I started doing this in the early 2000s and never looked back. No, I mean, there's no good evidence that video game violence causes violence in real life. I mean, I think that is a largely dead theory, and I think that informs some of these other areas. So there's no evidence of like sexism in games. Even if you take like a game like Grand Theft Auto, that people tend to think of as being sexist, whether that's fair or not. There's no evidence that playing those games make you like hate women more or anything of that sort of thing. So we just generally don't find a lot that suggests that content of video games causes people to change their behavior or change their attitudes in real life. So people really overestimated the impact the games had on people for the most part.
Some political activists believed that using social media campaigns to demand artists change artistic elements of their work was a good thing, like #ChangeTheCover. Some in GamerGate thought that this was going too far and or could have a chilling effect on artists. Do you have any thoughts on this tactic?
I mean, I'm not wild about these social media campaigns. I think that, I mean, of course, everybody has the right to speak. So we can't tell people they can't, campaign on social media, right? That's a First Amendment right, that people have the right to speak out, even if they're wrong. And what I think needs to happen is that companies need to get savvier about understanding that social media campaigns don't represent a consensus. That you can get, 10,000 people maybe on social media all angry about a thing, and they are absolutely wrong. And I think companies and politicians have really and academia has really struggled with that they see a bunch of people mad on Twitter and they think that they need to respond, and they really don't. Just give it 48 hours and those people will go away. And I think that's a mistake. I'm obsessed now with Wizards of the Coast. I think that's a mistake Wizards of the Coast made. I think it's a mistake that some video game producers have made. It certainly is the mistake that some universities have made. and certainly it's a mistake that some politicians have made. And people have got to get more savvy about this idea that social media campaigns are rubbish. And we need to be much more careful about understanding that what happens on Twitter does not represent any kind of societal consensus on a particular issue. It might raise an interesting hypothesis. I'm not saying ignore it entirely, but certainly we shouldn't panic and change policy, change content, all this kind of stuff because a few people are mad on social media. But unfortunately, that's what a lot of content producers have done over the last 5 to 10 years.
Where do you think the lines are between criticism and a censorship campaign?
I think everybody's open to criticism, right? I mean,
Well,
we should all
everybody's
have the
open
ability
to
to
criticism,
criticize
huh?
it. Well, I mean, everybody should be, or I should put it out, criticism should be open to everyone being allowed to do it. But that's what I meant. I shouldn't say, we're all humans. We're not going to really be open to criticism. I worded that badly. You know, it sounded like the different thing than what I meant it to sound like. No, we should allow people to engage in criticism, right? I think when things start to get into cancellation campaigns is when you're starting to call for people's jobs, you know, based on something that they said. And there could be some nuances around this. We might say, well, there probably are some situations that someone might say something that would indicate they can't do their job. You know, so for instance, if you see like I'm going to use extreme examples here, you know, so, and I think they're ones that most people would agree with, right? You know, so if you have like a school teacher who's advocating for like, you know, sex with underage children, right? You know, then they should not be a school teacher, right? And I think we all would probably agree with that, right? You know, so, or a police officer who's on Twitter saying that he hates black people and can't wait to go out and shoot a black person, right? They need to not be a police officer, right? So there are definitely extreme cases where people say things and maybe they shouldn't have their job, right? You know, because they're indicating that they can't do their job in a safe way. But I think where you get into like cancellation campaigns is where people say something that one group thinks is controversial, but it doesn't really impact their job. People just don't like what they said, you know, kind of thing. So, you know, you might say, you know, I don't believe we should have affirmative action, you know, in the United States, you know, for instance. And that's a debatable topic, right? You know, so some people believe we shouldn't. Some people would be very offended that you say we shouldn't have affirmative action, right? But if you're a truck driver, or a police officer, or a teacher, that opinion has no impact on your job. And people should not lose their jobs, you know, for saying those sort of things, right? And you know, and we have this concept called the Overton window, right? You know, that there's a range of opinions that are debatable, but are within the grounds of sort of normal, acceptable discourse. You know, so having different opinions about abortion, having different opinions about, you know, feminism, having different opinions about affirmative action and race, and things like that are all within the Overton window. And it's really just extreme things that end up, you know, if you say, again, I'm going to say things that I don't believe, so you have to be very clear, you know. So if you say like, you know, we really should kill all the Jews and get them out of Israel, right? You know, kind of thing. That's outside the Overton window. You know what I mean? Like that's really a bad thing to say. You know, and maybe people ought to look at you a little bit askance, you know, if you say things like that. But outside of those kind of extreme things, or like advocating pedophilia, you know, or advocating, you know, explicit racism or things like that, you know, that we should allow people to have the freedom to speak to a wide range of opinions, and they should be largely free from being fired from their jobs for, you know, expressing those opinions. Again, you know, the one exception again might be if you work for Burger King and you're on Twitter saying that Burger King sucks and their food is terrible. You probably shouldn't, you know, be surprised if you get fired from your job, right? It's but academics can do this, right? I love my university. Stetson's awesome, but if I went on Twitter and said Stetson sucks, you know, nobody should go there. We actually do have like pretty wide academic freedom even to criticize our own employers, and usually academics are not fired for saying things like that. But yeah, so I mean, cancellation is really trying to like get someone socially ostracized and like ruin their ability to function in society, based on ideas, based on ideas that are within the Overton window that some people find offensive. And unfortunately, I think we mostly come to our senses. We realized that there was a problem with cancellation in the U.S. and Europe and other places in Canada, and that this wasn't a good thing. So I think the needle has moved in a positive direction here. That
Really?
certainly cancellations still do happen. Yeah, I think so. I
So
think so.
that's what
I'm not trying to be
Destiny
Pollyanna.
says too, actually, and that he thinks that people
Yeah,
don't care anymore about what you said on Twitter 10 years ago,
that was a
except in extreme
mistake. That was
cases.
bad. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think. Well, I mean, look at like Richard Hanani is a good example of this. I don't know if you know him. He's a has a Substack. He's a conservative, thinker. He's pretty interesting to read. I don't always agree with him. I find I don't agree with him a lot, but he is interesting to read. And I think my understanding at least is that he when he's in his 20s said some stuff that was pretty explicitly racist, I think, and he's disavowed that since then. And he still has controversial views. He's still very conservative, but he doesn't say those sort of things. I think at least not that I've read anymore. And he still has a very successful Substack. So people kind of said, oh yeah, you probably shouldn't have said those things 20 years ago. I think he has said, yeah, I shouldn't have said those things 20 years ago, and everybody just kind of moved on. So I think we're getting a little bit better at that realizing that we shouldn't be punished forever for the worst thing we ever said or did. Because none of us can survive that. You know what I mean? Like,
True.
if everything is recorded that we ever say or think or do, I mean, literally our heroes, from Martin Luther to Gandhi, to JFK, nobody could survive, that level of scrutiny. And I think we need to be realistic that humans are flawed, fragile creatures, and we need to give people some opportunity to grow, particularly when they're young. That's why I see even with these like protesters and stuff like that, even the ones who are saying stuff like that's anti-Semitic, that yeah, I mean, we probably ought to do something about it now, particularly if it really is intimidating other people or harassing other people or whatever. But I don't think we should never hire them again, because they're adults, but they're 20, and I'm sure I said stupid shit when I was 20. I'm sure you did. I'm sure most people did, and people need to have the opportunity to grow, to reflect on shitty things they did in the past and move past them. Now, if they don't, they don't, you know what I mean? And we still can address that in the present. But if they do, then, at some point we need to let bygones be bygones. Because otherwise you get people that are advocating that murderers should be rehabilitated into society, which I'm fine with. But that people that said a racist joke in 2012 never should have a job again.
Right.
It's just
Right.
weird.
It's ridiculous.
That's just strange.
But I don't know. I feel like it is probably on the decline too. I think that sort of I can't think of any recent big examples other than I guess Cabrutus, right? Cabrutus, the Sweet Baby Ink employees trying to go after, but they
Yeah.
failed, right? They were unsuccessful,
Yeah.
which I think is partly indicative that
Yeah,
they don't have the power they used to.
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think 2020 was unusual. There was a lot of stuff going on, particularly around then that made these cancellations really a big deal. I think also it's helped. I mean, universities have obviously been called out, for this sort of stuff. We're supposed to be. I just bragged about Stetson. Stetson's really good about free speech, but a lot of universities are not. And I think they've been called out about it, and it's been really embarrassing for universities to have been called out for their inability to protect speech for students and faculty and staff in the past, and all of a sudden to discover it when Jews die, kind of thing, and that obvious hypocrisy, I think, has been really embarrassing for universities. I mean, obviously they've been called in front of Congress, and that kind of stuff, and so I think. Like I said, I mean, it's all about rewards and punishments, right? It's all about deterrence, and I think for a while cancellations were getting rewarded, right? And now they're not. And when you stop rewarding the behavior, it goes away, and that's why I keep saying I'm gonna harp on Wizards again. If Wizards would just stop changing their damn game every time someone freaked out on Twitter, those people go away. You know what I mean? Just stop it. But it takes a while for people to realize that sort of thing and change the incentive structure. So.
All right. Do you have any thoughts? Oh, I know you still have a hard out at 7. 7 Central.
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
have to wrap up in a few minutes
Okay.
here. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the removal of content from some foreign games when they're localized?
Oh, just I mean, unless it breaks the law, you know what I mean? Like, unless it's like child porn or something like that, just let people buy it. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, let the market take care of this stuff. You want to put labels on it, say there's extreme content, then just put the labels on it so people know what they're getting. Again, if it breaks the law, it breaks the law, and that's a different. So there are obscenity laws in the United States. They're pretty broad in the sense that it takes a lot. You know what I mean? To hit that stuff. So child porn would do it, obviously, or anything that looks like child porn.
Well, the
Um,
Lally stuff's not illegal, right?
oh God, I have to remember
I
I
don't
think
know.
there,
Well,
yeah,
I don't think it is, right? I think that it is legal, but I think some states have tried to make it legal, but it's like it's not gone through the courts yet, so nobody knows if they'll allow those specific cases. But I've not researched it or anything. I don't like.
yeah. I mean, and
I
obviously,
could be way off.
I don't love. I mean, these
I
are the
don't
sort of
like it
things like
either.
yeah, we can say the stuff's gross and awful, and whatever. Now, of course, like a company like Steam has the right to post whatever it wants, right? And they're not bound by the First Amendment, so they can have whatever content restrictions they want on something like that. So they might just decide like this stuff is gross and disgusting, and we're just not going to host it. And that's fine if they want to do that, for the most part. And like I said, certainly something like lolly porn is not the hill I'm going to die on. I mean, I just, but generally speaking, I'm not overly wild about changing the content around. I mean, it's going to be like a slippery slope argument, I guess. I mean, because
The
you see
laws
it
as
happen
they
the other
are seem
way.
fine to me.
Hmm.
I'm a
I
free
mean, you can see it
speech
go the other
person,
way
though.
around, right? We have like people are changing content when they send things to like China, right?
Well, that shouldn't happen either, though.
Right. No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
That's what I
yeah.
agree. That's if you kind of see where it can
They
lead
gotta
to.
they gotta take all the black characters on the poster and make them really small.
Yeah. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Well, it's funny. Like, I mean, China is known for being very racist, right? I mean, no offense to your Chinese listeners, whatever. There are many wonderful Chinese people. Don't get me wrong. There's not like but yeah, there was that famous commercial. It's probably 10 years old at this point, right? Where it's like for a laundry detergent. Have you ever
Oh,
seen this one?
I have seen this one recently, actually. But it's
Yeah.
actually, well, that commercial apparently was inspired by an Italian commercial that did something similar.
Well,
But it
the
was
Italians might be racist too. I don't
what?
know.
Yeah, I don't remember if I don't think in the Italian one he was black though. I don't know if
Yeah.
he was black or a different race. He
It
might have
was a
been
bad
Asian. He might
commercial.
have been
It was
Asian in the Italian one. I don't remember. But anyway, sorry, you were
yeah.
saying.
No, that's yeah. I was just pointing out that like yeah, I mean you can kind of say these edge cases where you're like oh yeah, that's pretty gross content. Maybe we should just get rid of that. Yeah, and okay. I mean, as long as you're looking at extreme stuff. Like I said, I'm not going to lose sleep over like lolly porn, being cut out. But just be aware of the you're opening a door, right? And that door can get wider. And just as long as you have some blocks on that, some guardrails, that you don't end up with the situation like you do in China, where you have to like cleanse everything, for that audience, or not for the audience really, it's for the politicians. Then that's the thing I would worry about. I know people hate slippery slope arguments, but that's really my concern. Is that you're going to take stuff that But I think like it would a lot of the stuff too. Even if you put it out there, I mean, I guess you would get like the curious buyers, right? People are like it's a controversy, therefore I need to see it. So I guess you're blocking them. But I guess I'm optimistic enough to think like the audience for some of like the really crazy ass extreme stuff. I guess you would get like the curious, and it wouldn't be terribly successful anyway. But maybe I don't know. Am I being Pollyannish about that? Am I being too optimistic?
I don't know about the Lally stuff or.
Well, I was also thinking like you had these video games that were like mass homicide. And these weren't like AAA games. I mean, these were like, some dude in Russia, like, in his basement made this game where you're like running through a school shooting the children or something like that, right? These kind of like school shooter games. And I don't think there's a big audience for that, right? I mean,
No,
you're
well,
going to
look
get
at
some curiosity.
You're gonna get
Curio.
people. You're gonna get people who buy it, like Hatred when it came out. You're gonna get people who buy
Yeah.
it because they want to stick it to the censors.
Yeah, that's fair.
But
That's
then,
fair.
but then, like people move on, they forget about the game, except for the controversy. All they remember is that they tried to censor it. That's the only thing people
Yeah.
will remember 5 years later.
Well, the irony is, if you just didn't make a big deal out in the first place, right, then nobody
Then
would
it
even know it
never
was there
would
or
have.
involved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
true. It's the
Yeah.
Streisand effect.
Exactly.
Well, hey, we finished games journalism. We finished artistic freedom. Next up is politics, then interactions with the
Oh
other
yes.
side. The politics of
We're gonna
GamerGate.
fix
Oh
politics.
boy, the politics of GG specifically too. So,
Okay. Cool. Cool.
hey, thanks for coming on. Is there anything else you want to talk about for part 4 before we close it out?
No, it's always awesome. It's always a lot of fun. I hope your listeners enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely, and we're still trying to get that debate set up between you and Mr. Height. So,
Yeah, we'll see.
yeah. All
We'll see
right.
what
Well, hey,
happens.
have a good night,
All right.
friend. We're gonna
Take
go ahead
care.
and raid somebody. Let's see who we're gonna raid real quick. You can drop out if you want, if you gotta go, or
All
you can
right.
stick around for 30
Take
seconds.
care.
Either way,
Have a good one.
we're gonna raid Destiny. We were just talking about him, so.